Lesson 5: Homicide and Gender in Criminal Court Outcomes. Homicide in Nova Scotia, 1749 to 1815. One of the oldest sanctions in human societies has been the prohibition against killing another human being. The Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, were the earliest laws given to the Hebrews and included a prohibition on killing. May and Phillips raise a variety of interesting questions in their analysis of homicide rates in Nova Scotia in the period between 1749 and 1815. Since Halifax was a British colony, it used English criminal law to deal with homicide cases. English criminal law is comprised of both common law and statute law. The common law differed from statutory law in that common law is a law system built up through the decisions of the courts. It is a body of customary law, based upon the judicial decisions and embodied in reports of decided cases. There is the importance of precedents derived from actual judgments. Statutory law, on the other hand, is derived from legislation, that is, statutes, passed in a legislative assembly, such as Parliament. In discussing homicide under English common law, May and Phillips point out that murder was always punishable by death, whereas a person convicted of manslaughter could claim benefit of clergy for a first offense. Manslaughter was a homicide committed without malice or forethought, often associated with sudden outbursts. Thus, May and Phillips's examples include deaths from fighting, such as a boxing match from 1791. Historical and even contemporary crime figures are difficult to deal with since there is always a so-called dark figure. In any criminal statistics, the number of offenses officially recorded inevitably falls short of the number of offenses actually committed, thus the dark figure. There are a variety of reasons for this, including whether the crime was reported, whether the crime was prosecuted, and how the crime was defined. Crime definition can be problematic if, for instance, several crimes are committed at the same time, such as a murder being committed during an armed robbery or burglary. Perhaps only the most serious crime, the murder, would count. Luckily for May and Phillips' study, homicide figures are the most reliable, since missing persons and dead bodies are less likely to go unnoticed. This study of homicide could simply have focused on the urban area of Halifax, but instead seeks a comparison between Halifax and the rest of Nova Scotia. This is important because it helps explain the homicide rates by allowing investigation of social contexts in which the crimes were committed. In the context of the time period, gender had an impact. While, as expected, more men were responsible for incidents of homicide, the high rate of homicidal violence in Halifax required greater explanation provided by the history and social context of the settlement. The soldier factors of large numbers of single men, a lot of heavy drinking, coupled with a culture of honor. Outside of Halifax, in the farming areas, where families dominated, there was a much lower homicide rate, and victims tended to know their murderers. This points to a more stable society. Farmers put down roots and have to get along with their neighbors, whereas military personnel are transient and will eventually move on somewhere else. While the male supermasculine culture of the military influence in Halifax illustrates the impact of male gender on the question of homicide, the question of women in homicide is also important and also highlights the social context of the historical period. Social context, rather than biological explanations, explain this as May and Phillips point to male authority and gender roles of the time, which limited female participation in crime. The social context of work and gender meant that women were tied to a domestic world of the hearth and home, either their own or employed in someone else's, and thus the types of crimes committed related to opportunity, theft of articles of food and clothing and so on. This might be termed a geography of theft. More illuminating of historical values in relation to women and homicide is the issue of women and infanticide. While infanticide has probably been present in all societies throughout time, the particular example of Nova Scotia in the period helps show infanticide laws could be used to enforce morality. The example here is the double standard for the death of a child to a wedded versus an unwedded mother. This points to a law that was designed to crack down on illegitimate births. Reading number 2. Gender and Criminal Court Outcomes and Historical Analysis. The image of Lady Justice, often seen at courthouses, is usually blindfolded, holding scales in one hand and a sword in the other. The scales suggest that Lady Justice will weigh the evidence and merits of a case to determine the outcome. The sword represents the authority and power of the court, which can impose sentences, including the ultimate sentence, capital punishment. Lady Justice's blindfold is key in the Western tradition of courts of law. Justice is supposed to be blind and impartial. Court outcomes are supposed to be based on the merits of the case, the evidence, and the interests of the accused and community. Although justice is supposed to be blind, in reality, does gender make a difference to the outcome of a case and whether or not there is a prison sentence? Research today suggests a predominant pattern of leniency based on gender, that is, leniency towards female offenders. One factor put forward to explain this supposed leniency in sentencing is the fact that women are usually less serious offenders than men. Another supposition is that married women and women with families are treated more leniently than single women and women without children. The idea here is that already under the constraints imposed by economic dependency, marriage, and family responsibilities, these women are treated more leniently than women not subject to these restrictions in their daily lives. If this is the case now, was this pattern evident earlier in the century? A fundamental principle of this course is that in order to understand the crime, you must look at the society in which the crime took place. This holds true for the present question of criminal court outcomes in the later 19th and early 20th centuries. Helen Boric looks at the impact of gender on criminal court outcomes in the later 19th and early 20th centuries, during a time period historians often refer to as the urban reform era or the progressive era. The later 19th century was a period of great change in Canada, as it was in most industrializing nations. It was a time of great demographic change as populations moved to the cities for work, resulting in greater urbanization, growth in the number and size of towns and cities. This demographic change was key to the urban reform era, as people, especially middle-class persons, began to worry about the changes this urbanization was having on the morality and behavior of people, especially women. Urbanization created fears over social problems, and increased urban populations were seen as contributing to increased crime in cities. More people meant more crime. Increased urban populations seemed to go hand in hand with more crime, disease, more poverty, and a decline in morality. This fear spurred activism and major reform efforts to eradicate these problems. A theme you will see again and again in this course is a focus of middle-class attention on the working classes and crime. Essentially, a class bias against the working class. A mission of middle-class reformers was to curb what it saw as vice and crime, and uplift the morality of the working class. The term hegemony is used to refer to the dominance of one group or state over others. And a way that one group establishes and maintains its dominance is by instilling its values throughout the society, trying to get everyone to believe what it believes. Thus, in the context of the urban reform era, as arguably today, the values of the middle class become dominant and reflected in the running of institutions, governments, the police, the courts, and so on. Middle class values dominate the society and shape the way the police and the courts deal with offenders. In the middle class values of the day, the ideal role for a woman was to marry and be a stay-at-home mother. The ideal of domesticity was that the woman stayed at home while a man worked outside of the house and brought in a wage. This urban ideal of the stay-at-home mother can be judged a middle-class ideal, since it bore no relation to the reality for many working-class women, who could not afford the luxury of not working outside of the home, in domestic service, a factory, an office, and so on. Boric, for example, gives an 1891 Ontario figure of women representing 12% of the wage labor force. Thus, a tenth of wage earners were women, which is significant, but what is also very significant about that figure is that it points to wage earners rather than salaried workers. Thus, almost by definition, the figure means working class rather than middle class women. During this period, women, like the working class in general, increasingly came under the microscope of middle class reformers. And women, like the working class more generally, became subject to ever-increasing sets of controls to enforce middle-class values and standards of femininity. Urbanization is partly to blame for this, as more and more women were in the workforce, outside of the home, and they were less under the control of a patriarchal figure, their father while in the family home or their husband in their new married home. Males and females had divided spheres. Men were in the public sphere and women were in the private sphere. Men worked outside the home and women worked inside the home, raising children and managing the household. Since men were in the public sphere, they were the principal objects of formal legal regulation. Men were more often on the streets, going to and from work. Women, in theory, were in the household, under the authority of the father or husband, and thus less subject to formal legal regulation. But the new urbanization meant that more and more young working women were increasingly moving to cities and towns where they might not have the stability and social control provided by a family or relations. From the 1880s, there was a growing reliance on informal social controls to shape the behavior of working class women, not just relying on police vigilance in public order offenses. These informal controls sought to exert positive influence on working class women who were outside of traditional family controls, with the goal to socialize women to their quote-unquote proper or appropriate roles in the society. Organizations, usually with a religious identification or affiliation, such as the YWCA, provided growing urban populations of single females, many of whom left the family to find work, with a variety of services including supervised accommodation and respectable recreational opportunities. Much work of this nature attempted to shape women before they fell to drink or immorality, to take the place of the supervisory role of the family. In the assumptions of the time, women were supposed to have higher moral standards than men. Women were simply seen as more pure, less corruptible. Thus, with such high middle-class ideals of what women should be and how they should act, it was particularly reprehensible for them to break with this behavior, especially in a public order offense. Thus, in this double standard, it was much more reprehensible for women to be drunk in public than men. It was almost expected, or at least condoned, in working-class men. There was an obsession with public order offenses, with drunkenness and immorality as a result of the form of working-class activities. In middle-class minds, drunkenness and immorality self-evidently led to disease, crime, and poverty. Public order offenses were particularly problematic, of course, because they took place in public. In addition to drunkenness, vagrancy was particularly important, as vagrancy laws were a primary means for dealing with prostitutes, particularly working-class prostitutes who worked the streets rather than those who worked indoors in brothels. The only place for sexuality was in the context of marriage and for the purpose of having children. Vagrancy laws were a traditional method for the state to round up persons without any identifiable home or occupation, but were increasingly used for various offenses against the good order of society, a kind of catch-all public order offense. Vagrancy laws in the urban reform era were used to criminalize prostitutes. The numbers of vagrancy offenses committed by women were not to do with problems of large numbers of women wandering the streets with no home, but rather women up to no good, or not having any appropriate business being out on the streets. Evidence of this concern during the urban reform era is that the maximum penalty for vagrancy was increased from 2 months to 2 years imprisonment. The purpose of the foregoing discussion of the urban reform era, the rise and dominance of middle-class values, and ideals on the expectation and roles of men in society, men and women, is to provide a greater background to understand the context of the society in which the criminal court outcomes are analyzed. This will help you interpret the effects of gender on the courts and to assess Borich's conclusions. Turning to the data and conclusions that Borich reaches. For the purpose of this course and this lesson, we are less interested in the methodology by which she arrives at her figures than in her conclusions about the effect of gender on criminal court outcomes. So pay attention to the conclusion and discussion portion rather than her methods at arriving them. Contrary to views of the relationship between gender and criminal court outcomes today, Borich's study suggests there was no particular chivalry in terms of women brought before the courts during the urban reform era. Women were held accountable for society's views of females as pure and moral, such that the very appearance of a woman before the court meant she was more likely to get a sentence. As she argues, by and large, judges appeared to adopt the attitude that the form of a woman's criminality took was secondary to the fact that a woman appeared before the court on any charge. It is up to you to assess the validity of her conclusions.